In the early months of 1940, the skies over Europe were dark with war. Nazi Germany had unleashed its blitzkrieg upon the continent, and with terrifying speed, countries fell one after the other. Britain stood alone, fiercely resisting German air raids during what would become known as the Battle of Britain, as the Royal Air Force, RAF, desperately fought to maintain air superiority over the British Isles. The British government began looking beyond its borders for help, particularly to the United States, a nation not yet at war but brimming with industrial power. At that time, the U.S. Army Air Corps was still flying older fighters like the P-40 Warhawk and P-39 Airacobra, planes that were already being pushed to their limits by newer German aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf Fw-190. The RAF, realizing that it could not wait for years for a revolutionary fighter from the Americans, reached out to a relatively young and ambitious company, North American Aviation. Headquartered in Inglewood, California, North American Aviation, NAA, was a rising star in the aviation world, though it had never built a high-performance fighter aircraft before. Led by the pragmatic and brilliant Dutch Kindleberger, NAA was producing the T-6 Texan trainer at the time, a reliable and successful aircraft, but nothing like a frontline fighter. The RAF initially asked NAA to produce the Curtiss P-40 under license, but Kindleberger made a bold counteroffer. Instead of manufacturing an already outdated design, why not build a brand new state-of-the-art fighter from scratch? It was a daring gamble, and it paid off. In April 1940, the British Purchasing Commission gave North American Aviation a contract to design and deliver the prototype of a new fighter within just 120 days. With the war raging in Europe and pressure mounting daily, the challenge was monumental. But Kindleberger and his chief engineer, Edgar Schmood, accepted it without hesitation. They had a vision, and more importantly, they had the drive to make it happen fast. Work began immediately. The entire project was codenamed NA-73X, and the team worked day and night, often sleeping at the factory and surviving on caffeine and adrenaline. Every element of the design was approached with the latest aerodynamics in mind. One of the key breakthroughs came in the form of a laminar flow wing, a revolutionary concept at the time. This type of wing had a shape that minimized drag and allowed the aircraft to fly faster and more efficiently at high speeds. Unlike many of its contemporaries, the NA-73X was designed from the ground up to maximize speed, range, and maneuverability. It featured an all-metal monocoque fuselage and a bubble canopy that would later offer unparalleled visibility to pilots. The cockpit was placed far enough back to balance the aircraft's center of gravity, but close enough to the wing's leading edge for superior control. Another crucial innovation was the use of a large radiator scoop located under the fuselage. Initially thought to be a potential source of drag, the scoop was carefully designed to actually contribute to the aircraft's thrust by using the Meredith effect. Hot air exiting the scoop was expelled with such force that it added a small but significant boost to the plane's speed. On October 26, 1940, just 117 days after the contract was signed, the prototype NA-73X took to the skies for the first time. The test flight, conducted at Mines Field in Los Angeles, proved the plane was everything the designers had hoped for, and more. It handled beautifully, was faster than expected, and had great potential as a combat aircraft. But it wasn't. Yet the legend it would become. At this point, the Mustang was powered by the Allison V1710 engine, a reliable power plant that worked well at low and medium altitudes, but suffered greatly above 15,000 feet. This was a critical flaw. Most aerial combat over Europe was happening at high altitude, and the Mustang, despite its elegance and innovation, wasn't yet ready for that fight. Still, the RAF went ahead and began testing the new aircraft, calling The Mustang MKI British pilots quickly recognized the Mustang's potential. At low altitudes, it was incredibly fast, agile, and well-suited for reconnaissance and ground attack missions. It could outrun and outturn German fighters in certain scenarios, especially during hit-and-run raids and strafing runs over enemy positions. But its limitations at altitude meant it couldn't yet challenge the Luftwaffe where it mattered most, escorting bombers deep into enemy territory. It was around this time that the Mustang caught the attention of engineers on both sides of the Atlantic who believed it had even greater potential if only it had the right engine. The British, especially, began thinking about mating the Mustang's sleek airframe with their own Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same engine that powered the legendary Supermarine Spitfire. That idea would become the turning point in the story. Of the P-51 Mustang, the RAF began testing Mustangs with the Merlin 61 engine in late 1942, and the results were nothing short of astonishing. With the Merlin installed, the Mustang suddenly became a high-altitude killer. It could now climb faster, fly higher, and maintain performance deep into enemy airspace. The British were thrilled, and so were the Americans once they got wind of the transformation. The United States Army Air Forces, USAAF, which had initially been lukewarm about the Mustang, suddenly saw the light. They ordered the new version, known as the P-51B, into production with the Packard VU 1650, an American-built version of the Merlin engine. From that moment on, the Mustang would never be the same. Its future as a long-range escort fighter was secured, and it was about to change the course of the air war over Europe. When the British test pilots first took the Merlin-powered Mustang to the skies, they immediately realized this wasn't just a better Mustang, it was a game-changer. The marriage between the streamlined American airframe and the powerful, high-altitude Rolls-Royce Merlin engine transformed the aircraft from a low-altitude attacker into a world-class interceptor, capable of engaging enemy fighters at cruising altitudes over Europe. The engine swap dramatically improved the plane's performance at altitudes over 20,000 feet, which was where Allied bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator flew during daylight raids deep into German-held territory. Before the Mustang's reinvention, the USAAF had been suffering heavy losses due to the inability of existing fighters like the P-38 Lightning and the P-47 Thunderbolt to escort bombers all the way to their targets and back. The Luftwaffe would patiently wait until these escorts had to turn back, then tear through unprotected bomber formations with deadly efficiency. But with the Merlin-powered P-51, that changed. Capable of flying over 400 miles per hour at altitude, and with a range extended by drop tanks to more than 1,500 miles, the new Mustang could now accompany bomber groups from bases in England to Berlin and back, a distance that had previously meant certain death for many American crews. It was the aircraft that the USAF had been waiting for, and its impact on the war effort would be immediate and profound. The first of these new models, designated P-51B and P-51C for those built at the Dallas, Texas plant, entered combat service. In Europe, in late 1943, they were assigned to the 8th Air Force, the unit responsible for strategic daylight bombing over occupied Europe and Nazi Germany. As soon as the P-51s started flying bomber escort missions, Luftwaffe pilots began to encounter something they hadn't faced before: a fast, agile enemy fighter with the legs to stay in the fight from takeoff to target and all the way home. One of the first American pilots to truly push the Mustang's potential was Major George Preddy, who would later become one of the highest-scoring Mustang aces of the war. He and others flying the Mustang adopted aggressive tactics, often diving into enemy formations, breaking up attacks before they could even begin, and chasing down German fighters with unmatched speed and maneuverability. The Mustang could outdive and outturned most of the Luftwaffe's top-line fighters, and its 650 caliber Browning machine guns packed a devastating punch. In the skies over Europe, a deadly cat-and-mouse game developed between Mustang pilots and Luftwaffe aces. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf Fw-190 were formidable aircraft, and in the hands of experienced German pilots, they remained deadly adversaries. But the tide was turning. Mustang squadrons began to score kill after kill. The Luftwaffe, which had once ruled the skies, found itself being hunted. And it wasn't just bomber escort. The Mustang was used for fighter sweeps, strafing enemy airfields and attacking trains, convoys and fuel depots, crippling the German war machine from above. Perhaps the most iconic symbol of the Mustang's impact was the Big Week Offensive in February 1944. In a coordinated effort between the 8th and 15th Air Forces, hundreds of bombers launched attacks on German aircraft production facilities and airfields. For the first time, they were accompanied from takeoff to return by long-range escort fighters. The Luftwaffe responded with everything it had, resulting in massive aerial battles involving thousands of aircraft. It was during Big Week that the Mustang truly proved its worth. Losses among bomber crews dropped dramatically, and Luftwaffe units were decimated. The Mustang had not just entered the war, it had changed it. At home, North American Aviation ramped up production to meet the soaring demand. Factories in Inglewood, California and Dallas, Texas, operated day and night. By mid-1944, P-51s were rolling off assembly lines in unprecedented numbers. Pilots were clamoring to fly the Mustang, not only because it gave them a fighting chance to survive, but because it was a joy to fly. In fact, the Mustang's flight characteristics were so refined that pilots often described it as an extension of the body. It responded smoothly to control inputs, had excellent visibility with the later addition of the bubble canopy, and could operate from rough airstrips if needed. It was fast, agile, reliable, and lethal. As its reputation grew, so did its list of aces. In addition to George Preddy, pilots like Bud Anderson, Chuck Yeager, and Clarence "Bud" Mahurin added to the Mustang's legend. Some of them would go on to fly into the jet age, but they all looked back on the Mustang with reverence. One of the Mustang's most remarkable legacies was its role in the collapse of the Luftwaffe. As German aircraft losses mounted and as experienced pilots were killed or captured, the Luftwaffe struggled to train new pilots fast enough. Meanwhile, Mustang squadrons grew larger, better trained, and more confident with each passing month. By the summer of 1944, the skies over Europe belonged to the Allies, and the P-51 Mustang was the spearhead of that dominance. But the Mustang's story didn't end there. In the coming months, it would find new battlegrounds in Italy and the Pacific, earn respect in dogfights against Japan's finest, and eventually play a role in the final battles of World War II. Still, for all its speed, grace, and killing power, the true legacy of the Mustang was this. It saved lives. Thousands of bomber crews came home because of it. Air superiority was achieved because of it. And victory in the skies was secured with it as Europe burned and the Mustang proved itself over the skies of France and Germany. Another theater of war demanded attention: the Pacific. While the war against Nazi Germany was rapidly turning in the Allies' favor, the conflict against Imperial Japan was far from over. Vast stretches of ocean, scattered islands, tropical jungles, and a fiercely determined enemy presented a different set of challenges for the P-51 Mustang and its pilots. Unlike the tightly packed air battles over Europe, the Pacific War demanded range above all else. American forces needed fighters that could escort bombers across the seemingly endless reaches of ocean, from island to island, and eventually to the Japanese homeland. The P-38 Lightning had carried that burden for much of the war, But by 1944, the Mustang was ready to take over. The long-range capability that made the Mustang invaluable in Europe proved just as effective in the Pacific. With drop tanks under its wings, the P-51 could fly over 2,500 miles, enough to escort B-29 superfortresses from air bases in the Mariana Islands all the way to Tokyo and back. This kind of reach was something no other single-engine Allied fighter could match with the same level of performance, but the Pacific theater posed its own engineering and operational hurdles. The intense humidity and heat, the exposure to salt air, the lack of well-developed runways, all these were tests for both pilots and machines. Yet the P-51, with its sturdy frame and powerful Packard-built Merlin engine, endured it all. Maintenance. Crews, often working in brutal conditions on primitive airstrips, praised the aircraft's relative ease of upkeep and the resilience of its systems. One of the earliest Mustang units to operate in the Pacific was the famed 15th Fighter Group, flying from Iwo Jima in early 1945. Their mission was one of the most dangerous of the war, escorting B-29s to and from bombing raids over Japan. These flights could last 8 hours or more, pushing both man and machine to their limits. Many Mustang pilots had to refuel mid-mission or navigate back over the ocean with fuel tanks nearly dry, engines sputtering on fumes. The psychological strain of these missions was immense. Pilots flew for hours with nothing but water and sky. Below them, knowing that a mechanical failure or enemy fire could leave them floating alone in shark-infested waters. And yet they flew, again and again. The reward was devastatingly effective. Japanese fighters like the Mitsubishi Zero, while agile and deadly at lower speeds, struggled to match the Mustang's high-speed dives and rugged firepower. P-51 pilots developed tactics that neutralized the Zero's advantages, using superior speed and vertical maneuvers to avoid tight dogfights and instead strike hard and fast. These hit-and-run tactics, paired with the Mustang's 50-caliber machine guns, were devastatingly effective. One of the Mustang's most respected roles during these missions was bomber defense. B-29 crews grew to deeply appreciate the sight of P-51s alongside them, especially as they neared the Japanese coast. When swarms of Japanese fighters rose to meet the bombers, Mustangs broke off from formation to intercept, sometimes engaging in fierce battles just miles from their targets. One such pilot was James Tapp, the first P-51 ace in the Pacific, flying with the 506th Fighter Group. Tapp's aggressive flying and quick reflexes earned him multiple victories in a short span, and he became a symbol of the Mustang's success in the Pacific. Like his counterparts in Europe, he spoke of the Mustang with respect bordering on reverence. But it wasn't only about combat. The Mustang's ability to project power far from base also played a key role in the psychological warfare being waged. In the final months of the war, Japanese forces, once confident that their homeland was safe from regular fighter patrols, were shocked to find American fighters strafing runways, attacking airfields, and even flying low over Tokyo itself. The very presence of Mustangs so deep in enemy territory shattered the illusion of invincibility. Japan's air defenses were stretched thin, and the introduction of P-51 squadrons in coordinated raids with B-29s signaled that no target was beyond the Allies' reach. Even kamikaze bases, once protected by geography, now found themselves invulnerable. Technologically, the Mustang continued to evolve even during wartime. While the early P-51BC models had made their mark, it was the P-51D variant that truly came to define the aircraft. Introduced in 1944, the D model featured several critical improvements based on pilot feedback and battlefield necessity. The most obvious was the new bubble canopy, which replaced the older frame design and gave pilots a 360-degree view. essential for spotting enemy aircraft in dogfights. The dorsal fin was extended to improve stability at high speeds, and the aircraft's armament was increased to 650 caliber machine guns. The internal fuel capacity was also boosted, enhancing range even without drop tanks. Under the hood, the Packard V1657 Merlin engine continued to be refined for durability and performance. Mechanics often marveled at its ability to perform under the harshest conditions, and pilots trusted it with their lives. It was a rare example of American industry perfectly adapting British engineering to meet new challenges on a global scale. As Japan's position grew desperate and Allied forces closed in, the Mustang became a symbol of inevitable defeat. Pilots flew missions over Japan with confidence, knowing they had the advantage in speed, altitude, and firepower. Even Japan's newest jet-powered interceptor, the Nakajima Kika, came too late to change the course of the war, and the P-51 dominated the skies until the very end. By the time Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in August 1945, the P-51 Mustang had become one of the most celebrated aircraft in aviation history. It had flown in every theater of World War II, from the muddy fields of Britain to the jungles of Burma, the deserts of North Africa to the volcanic islands of the Pacific. But the war's end did not mark the end of the Mustang's legacy. Far from it. In fact, the story of the P-51 was only entering a new chapter. As the guns fell silent in 1945 and the world slowly began to heal from the devastation of World War II, millions of servicemen returned home. Armies were downsized, factories shifted to civilian production, and thousands of aircraft were mothballed or scrapped. But the P-51 Mustang didn't fade into obscurity. It endured. In fact, in many ways, its second life was just beginning. By the war's end, over 15,000 Mustangs had been built, serving not only the United States, but also allied nations such as Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and China. Though many aircraft were retired, a large number were preserved for reserve forces or sold to allied countries. The Mustang's solid engineering, adaptability, and sheer performance meant that even in peacetime, it had value. The emerging geopolitical tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, soon dubbed the Cold War, meant that military preparedness remained a top priority. In this new environment, the P-51 found itself serving in air forces around the world well into the late 1940s and early 1950s. One of the most notable chapters in the Mustang's post-war service came with the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950. When North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel into South Korea, the United Nations and United States responded swiftly, deploying troops and aircraft to repel the invasion. At the time, the newly created United States Air Force had already begun transitioning to jet fighters like the F-80 Shooting Star. But these jets lacked the range and ruggedness to operate from improvised airstrips in Korea. Enter the P-51 once more, renamed F-51 to reflect the USAF's updated designation system. The Mustang was pressed back into frontline service. It was fast enough to survive, reliable enough to maintain in field conditions, and rugged enough to carry heavy payloads. But it was no longer being used primarily for air-to-air combat. In Korea, the Mustang was transformed into a ground attack. Aircraft strafing enemy troops, trains, and supply lines, often flying low and fast through mountainous terrain. These missions were dangerous. F-51 pilots flew through heavy anti-aircraft fire and faced the threat of enemy ambushes from hidden positions. Many aircraft were lost and casualties were high. But the Mustang once again proved its value, particularly in the early months of the war when jet support was limited. Perhaps the most poignant symbol of the Mustang's longevity came when former World War II aces, now senior officers, or recalled. Veterans returned to combat flying the same aircraft they had mastered years before. It was a full-circle moment for a generation of airmen whose careers had been forged in the skies of Europe and the Pacific. By the mid-1950s, however, the jet age had truly taken over. New aircraft like the F-86 Sabre and MiG-15 were rewriting the rules of aerial combat. Against these sleek, swept-wing fighters, the Mustang's days as a frontline weapon were clearly numbered. And yet, its retirement was not universal. Around the globe, Mustangs continued to serve in dozens of countries, from Israel and Indonesia to Sweden and South Africa. Each of these nations adapted the aircraft to their needs. Some used it for training, others for ground support or even border patrol. It became a symbol of air power for developing air forces, a bridge between the propeller-driven legacy of World War II and the dawn of supersonic flight. Even as it disappeared from military roles, the Mustang experienced a renaissance in civilian life. Surplus P-51s were sold to private collectors, and some were restored to airworthy condition. These aircraft began to appear at air shows, dazzling crowds with their speed and the unmistakable roar of the Merlin engine. Then came the Reno air races, and the Mustang found a new battlefield. Modified and tuned to extreme levels, racing Mustangs like Strega, Dago Red, and Voodoo roared around pylons at over 500 miles per hour, often flown by former military pilots or passionate aviators who had spent years restoring the aircraft. The Mustang became not just a warbird, but a symbol of speed, engineering, and determination. Meanwhile, museums and aviation foundations around the world began restoring P-51s to their original configurations. These aircraft, some flown by famous aces or involved in historic missions, were now considered priceless relics of aviation history. Efforts were made to preserve original markings, paint schemes, and equipment to honor the men who flew them and the missions they completed. Pilots who once flew Mustangs in combat were invited to reunions and commemorative flights, many climbing back into the cockpits of aircraft they had not seen since their youth. Tears were common. The memories of fear, courage, camaraderie, and loss returned with every familiar vibration of the throttle or howl of the Merlin. Beyond nostalgia, the P-51 Mustang came to represent something much deeper. The moment when America's industrial might, engineering genius, and wartime urgency came together to produce not just a superior weapon, but a legend. It was the embodiment of a generation that rose to meet global tyranny with resolve and sacrifice, and that legacy continues today. The Mustang is now one of the most sought-after vintage aircraft in the world. Less than 200 remain airworthy, and each one is treated with reverence. New generations of pilots trained to fly them not for war, but for heritage, for the privilege of experiencing what it was like to control one of the greatest fighters ever built. In aviation museums, schoolchildren gather around Mustangs, listening to veterans or tour guides tell stories of epic dogfights over Berlin, of long escorts over Tokyo, of bullet holes in fuselages and desperate landings on shattered runways. In flight sims and documentaries, the P-51 continues to educate and inspire. But beyond its wings and engine, the Mustang tells a human story. A story of risk, vision, collaboration, and courage. It is a story of a country rising to a global challenge, of engineers betting everything on a radical design, of pilots who learned to fly faster and further than ever before. The P-51 Mustang is not just an airplane. It is memory made of metal, a roar that echoes through history, a tribute to every life it helped protect and every dream it continues to lift into the sky. In the decades since the last P-51 Mustang flew in combat, its image has only grown stronger, etched into history not just as a fighter plane, but as an icon. Wherever people speak of World War II or the valor of pilots who risked everything, the Mustang stands nearby. It is more than aluminum and rivets. It is a symbol, a monument in motion. From classrooms to hangars, from documentaries to war memorials. The silhouette of the Mustang, with its graceful wings, its distinct belly scoop and its proud nose, remains instantly recognizable. And that is no accident. The aircraft represents far more than technological achievement. It captures an era, a moment when the world stood on the edge, and brave men and women turned the tide with ingenuity and courage. The Mustang came to embody the spirit of the arsenal of democracy, a term coined by President Franklin D. Roosevelt to describe America's unprecedented industrial mobilization. North American aviation didn't just design a new fighter, it redefined what a fighter could be. In a time of crisis, under impossible deadlines, a team of dreamers and engineers created a machine that outflew fear. But it wasn't just the designers or the brass who shaped the Mustang's story, it was the pilots. Some were young farm boys who had never seen the ocean. Others were Ivy League graduates who left their studies behind. Some flew over Germany, others over Burma. Many never came home. Yet in their brief, brilliant moments in the cockpit, they left behind stories that would be told for generations. The P-51 is also inseparable from the legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen, the first black military aviators in the U.S. Armed Forces. Facing prejudice and skepticism, these airmen proved their worth time and time again, flying with distinction and valor in their red-tailed Mustangs. They escorted bombers with unmatched discipline and protected their charges with a determination born not just from duty, but from the need to prove their place in a world that doubted them. Their story became one of the most powerful chapters in the history of American aviation, not only because of their combat success, but because of what they overcame. Today, many restored Mustangs wear red tails in tribute. The name Tuskegee has become a symbol not only of heroism in the air, but of progress on the ground. As the years moved on, the Mustang's cultural footprint expanded. It appeared in books, movies, television series, and video games. From Hollywood blockbusters to documentary tributes, the P-51 always commands the screen. Its roar, deep, smooth, and unmistakable, remains one of the most beloved engine notes in aviation. In air shows around the world, the Mustang continues to fly. Spectators pause and look up as it makes low passes, trailing smoke or executing barrel rolls. Children point, veterans salute, pilots smile. Some of these aircraft bear the names of their original wartime pilots: Old Crow, Glamorous Glenn, Moonbeam McSwine, names that once adorned fuselages diving into enemy skies, now kept alive in paint and memory. It is not just the warbird community that honors the Mustang. Engineers and historians alike study its design, marveling at its balance between form and function. The laminar flow wing, once revolutionary, still informs modern aerodynamics. The Meredith effect, radiator scoop, once questioned, now recognized as a stroke of genius. The cockpit layout, the fuselage strength, the harmony of airframe and engine, all are still admired. But more than any blueprint, the Mustang's essence lies in how it made pilots feel. It made them feel fast, alive, capable of anything. It gave bomber crews a fighting chance. It gave engineers pride in what was possible. It gave the world a reason to believe that even in the darkest of times, human creativity and will could produce something beautiful. In the years following World War II, many Mustang pilots went on to shape the future of flight. Some joined the nascent jet programs. Others helped found NASA or became airline captains. But almost all of them, when asked, would say that no aircraft ever made them feel like the Mustang did. One of them, a former ace named Bud, once said, "When you climbed into a Mustang, it wasn't just a machine. It was a friend, a weapon, a dance partner. She knew how to move, and she'd never let you down if you treated her right." The last time the US military deployed the Mustang was during the 1950s, but even now, over 80 years since its first flight, more than 150 examples still fly, lovingly maintained by private owners, museums, and warbird foundations. Their wings may be old, but their purpose remains: to remind us of the engineers who built them under pressure, of the nations that believed in freedom, of the men who flew them into fire and the lives they helped save. They remind us that even in war, something timeless can be born, something that speaks not of destruction, but of determination, of passion, of flight. Today, as you walk through a museum hangar and see a polished Mustang resting silently under soft light, or as one streaks above a tarmac under the afternoon sun, you're not just looking at an artifact. You're looking at a story written in the sky, a story that begins with a bold promise in California in 1940 and continues every time a Mustang rises off the runway, banking into history one more time. The P-51 Mustang is more than a warplane. It is freedom forged in aluminum, a voice of courage, a thunderbolt of hope. And though its enemies are long gone, it still flies, not to fight but to remember, forever a guardian of the past, forever a symbol of the sky.